Somewhere beneath the tangled roots of an ancient forest, in land that would one day become the United States, a predator that had ruled its world for over 2 million years is about to meet an enemy it cannot outmuscle, outrun, or outlast. This is not a story about claws against claws or fangs against fangs. This is the story of the single most successful predator North America had ever produced, brought down not by a rival beast, but by a creature standing on 2 legs, armed with sharpened stone and a plan. By the end of this video, you will understand why scientists still argue over what really killed the saber-tooth tiger, and you will see, piece by piece, how one of the most feared hunters in the history of life on Earth was quietly erased from the forest floor. If you enjoy videos like this, subscribe to the channel now and drop a like. The forest is dense and half frozen, a mix of spruce and fir pressed close together, their branches heavy with the last snow of a dying winter. Somewhere in the shadows between the trunks, 13,000 years ago, a Smilodon fatalis moves without sound. Weighing close to 230 kilograms, this is not a lean, fast pursuit predator. It does not chase. It waits, and it relies on a weapon most people would never expect from an animal this size. Not its jaws, but its front legs. Engineering studies that ran digital crash test simulations on Smilodon skulls found something that surprised the scientific community. Despite the enormous canines, the bite force generated by its jaw muscles alone was weak, roughly 1,000 newtons, about a third of what a lion of the same size can produce, and closer to the bite of a jaguar, less than half its weight. A skull built to survive that kind of low bite force, but subjected to the stress of a thrashing, struggling animal, would have been at serious risk of fracture. What made Smilodon lethal was not raw jaw power, but its forelimbs, unusually thick, heavily muscled, and built more like a bear's than a modern cat's. Researchers now believe this cat used its powerful arms and body weight to physically drag prey to the ground and pin it in place, immobilizing an animal many times its own size before ever using its teeth. Only once the prey's head and neck were secured could the long blade-like canines, which could exceed 17 centimeters in length, be brought down through the throat in a single controlled strike aimed precisely along the neck to avoid snapping the flattened canines against bone. The bite came only as a finishing move, delivered after the ambush had already won the fight. That explains why so many Smilodon skeletons recovered from fossil sites show old, healed fractures in their limbs and ribs, injuries consistent with a lifetime spent in close contact combat with animals that fought back hard before going down. For nearly 2 million years, this strategy worked. The saber-tooth cat did not need to be fast, because its prey was enormous and slow to react. Ground sloths the size of small cars, ancient bison with horn spans wider than a doorway, young mammoths still growing into their tusks, all moved through forests and grasslands where an ambush predator with patience and raw power could dominate without ever needing to run more than a few explosive meters. This was an animal built to win fights, not to avoid them. Almost everything scientists know about this predator comes from a single, extraordinary place: the asphalt seeps of what is now Los Angeles, California, better known as the La Brea tar pits. For tens of thousands of years, crude oil seeped up through cracks in the ground and pooled on the surface, often hidden beneath a thin layer of dust, leaves, or rainwater. A wounded or drinking animal that wandered onto one of these seeps could become trapped in asphalt sticky enough to hold a 200-kilogram body in place, and its distress calls would draw in predators and scavengers looking for an easy meal, which then became trapped themselves. Over thousands of years, this cycle repeated so often that researchers have pulled more than 2,000 individual Smilodon skeletons from the seeps, an almost unbelievable concentration of a single apex predator preserved in one location, alongside dire wolves, American lions, and giant birds of prey caught in the exact same trap. It is this enormous sample size, rare for any extinct large predator, that allowed scientists to compare dozens of complete skeletons side by side and finally settle long-running debates about how this animal actually killed. This reliance on brutal, close-quarters kills may also explain one of the more debated aspects of Smilodon biology, whether it hunted alone or in groups. At La Brea, researchers noticed something unusual compared to other fossil predators trapped in the same seeps. Animals with severe, disabling injuries, a fractured pelvis, a shattered jaw, hip damage that would have made hunting or even walking difficult, still show clear signs of bone healing, meaning these individuals survived for weeks or months after being hurt. A solitary predator with those kinds of injuries would likely have starved. Some paleontologists argue this points to a social animal, living and hunting in loose groups where an injured member could still be fed or protected, similar to a lion pride rather than a solitary tiger. Others caution that survival after injury is not, by itself, proof of social living, and the debate remains unresolved. What is better established is that Smilodon canines grew slowly, taking roughly 3 years to fully develop, a combination of rapid initial growth followed by a long finishing period. Isotope analysis of canine enamel suggests that during this long adolescence, young Smilodon were likely incapable of making a proper killing bite and would have depended on adults to provide food, another detail that fits more naturally with a species living in family groups than one raising cubs in total isolation. Somewhere between 15 and 11,000 years ago, something entered the forest that did not fight fair and did not fight alone. Small groups of humans, associated with what archaeologists call the Clovis tool-making tradition, began moving through the same landscapes the saber-tooth cats called home. Clovis technology is defined by a distinctive fluted stone point, chipped with a groove down the base so it could be firmly hafted onto a wooden shaft. This design spread across nearly the entire North American continent in the span of roughly a single millennium, an extraordinarily fast expansion for a Stone Age culture. Exactly how these points were deployed is still debated. Long-standing assumptions that Clovis hunters relied on the atlatl, a lever-like throwing tool that could launch a dart with tremendous force from a distance, have recently been challenged by dating studies showing no confirmed atlatl remains from that early period. This has pushed some researchers back toward the idea of long, braced thrusting spears, used defensively and offensively at closer range, sometimes literally planted into the ground to receive the charge of a wounded animal. Whichever weapon was used, the outcome was the same. A coordinated group of hunters, working together, could take down an animal the size of a mammoth in a way no single predator, however powerful, ever could alone. Researchers studying this period increasingly describe the disappearance of North America's megafauna not as one event, but as 3 overlapping stages. First came a foreshock, as shifting late glacial climate patterns combined with the earliest trickle of human foragers to fragment once continuous herds into smaller, isolated populations. Second came a much sharper shock, as Clovis groups spread rapidly and began deliberately targeting these already weakened pockets of animals, hunting them at a pace their reproduction could not offset. Third came a long aftershock, an extended period of continued hunting pressure, shrinking gene pools, and fierce competition for what large prey remained, during which entire species quietly blinked out one after another. This staged model helps explain why the extinction, while catastrophic, did not happen instantly. It was a slow strangulation of a food web that had operated one way for millions of years, and suddenly could not withstand a predator capable of learning, planning, and adapting faster than evolution could respond. This is where the real confrontation begins, not as a single dramatic battle, but as a slow-motion collision between 2 predators competing for one shrinking resource. Imagine a forest clearing at dusk. A family group of mammoths moves cautiously between the trees, wary, because both the cats and the humans have learned an identical lesson. Young or wounded mammoths are vulnerable, and vulnerability draws predators from every direction. A Smilodon crouched in the undergrowth has been tracking this group for hours, waiting for a calf to separate from the adults. But it is not alone in this forest. A short distance away, a band of Clovis hunters has been tracking that very herd, reading the same tracks and droppings, watching for the exact opening the cat is also waiting for. The mammoths are being stalked from 2 different directions by 2 entirely different kinds of intelligence, and only one of them is capable of planning an ambush that spans several days. When the moment comes, it is the humans who move first, not because they are faster, but because they do not need to get close. A volley of braced spears, driven home with the full weight of several hunters working together, strikes a young mammoth separated at the edge of the tree line. The Smilodon, drawn by that opening, arrives to find the carcass already surrounded, already claimed, defended by numbers it cannot outfight without risking the one thing it cannot afford to lose: an unbroken canine. This is the moment paleontologists believe repeated itself thousands upon thousands of times across the closing millennia of the Ice Age. Not saber-tooth cats hunted down one by one in direct combat, but saber-tooth cats slowly and systematically pushed out of the one advantage they had always relied upon, which was uncontested access to enormous, slow-moving prey. The isotope signature locked inside those Brea fossils shows a diet built almost entirely around large herbivores, precisely the species being hunted with increasing efficiency by human groups spreading across the continent. As these massive herbivores declined, some species disappearing entirely within a few thousand years, the Smilodon had nowhere left to turn. Unlike smaller, more flexible predators that could shift toward rabbits, deer, or scavenging, the saber-tooth cat's entire anatomy worked against it. Its short, powerful legs were built for a single ambush charge rather than sustained pursuit, and its massive canines were built for prey with thick necks and heavy bodies, leaving it almost completely unable to adapt to a world of smaller, faster, more elusive animals. Climate mattered too, and the numbers back it up. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate of the northern hemisphere flipped abruptly back toward near-glacial conditions in an event known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap that struck right in the middle of the window when Clovis hunters were spreading across the continent. Across North America, roughly 70% of large mammal genera, 37 separate genera weighing more than 44 kilograms, vanished within the tight span between about 13,000 and 12,000 years ago. Forests thickened in some regions and vanished in others. Watering holes shifted, and migration routes that had existed for tens of thousands of years broke apart at exactly the moment prey populations could least afford it. But most researchers today agree the climate shift alone does not fully explain either the timing or the scale of the disappearance, since similar warming and cooling swings had occurred earlier in the Pleistocene without wiping out the megafauna. What made this moment different, most paleontologists argue, was the combination. A hunter intelligent enough to adapt to changing conditions in ways no other predator on the continent ever could, arriving at precisely the moment climate stress had already left prey populations fragmented and vulnerable. The scale of what happened becomes clear when you look at who else disappeared alongside the saber-toothed tiger, right here on the land that is now the United States. Excavations across dozens of sites show that mammoths, mastodons, ancient horses, camels, dire wolves, American lions, giant short-faced bears, ground sloths, and tapirs all vanished within that narrow window, right at what researchers call the Rancho-Lebrian termination. At one set of more than 70 geoarchaeological sites studied across the continent, the vast majority show the bones of these animals lying directly beneath the sediment layer, marking the Younger Dryas boundary. And then, nothing. Only one large species crossed that line in real numbers and kept going. The bison, whose sheer population size may have been the one thing large enough to absorb the hunting and climate pressure that erased almost everything around it. For a predator like Smilodon, entirely dependent on the very largest, slowest herbivores on the continent, the disappearance of so many of its prey species at once was not a gradual inconvenience. It was the removal of nearly its entire food supply within the span of a few human lifetimes. There is even a way to read this stress directly off the teeth. Dental microwear texture analysis, a technique that examines microscopic scratches and pits left on tooth enamel by the last meals an animal ever chewed, shows that Smilodon fatalis at Brea consumed noticeably harder foods, including more bone, during the coldest, most resource-scarce stretches of the late Pleistocene. This pattern of heavier carcass utilization, animals eating further into a kill, cracking bone for marrow rather than leaving it behind, is a classic signature of a predator population under nutritional pressure, forced to extract every possible calorie from an increasingly scarce number of kills. Tellingly, the American lion sharing the same landscape shows no comparable increase in bone consumption, its microwear pattern staying closer to that of a modern cheetah that avoids bone entirely, which suggests Smilodon was hit harder by the shrinking prey base than at least one of its major competitors. This pattern, driven by the same underlying pressures, played out further south. In South America, an even larger relative of the Californian cat, Smilodon populator, faced its own extinction in step with the spread of fishtail projectile points, a distinct but related tool-making tradition that shares its rough age and function with Clovis technology farther north. Researchers who mapped the spatial overlap between fishtail points and South American megafauna found the relationship seen in North America repeating itself. As human population density and fluted point sites increased across a region, the large mammals sharing that landscape collapsed soon after. Two continents, two different saber-toothed species, two independently evolved stone tool traditions, and one outcome arriving on nearly identical timelines is difficult to explain as coincidence. Scientists call this combined explanation the overkill hypothesis, first proposed by geoscientist Paul Martin in the 1960s. His original version put almost all the blame on human hunters, arriving in a landscape full of prey animals with no evolved fear of a tool-using, planning predator. Decades of further research, including the population studies behind the three-stage collapse model, have refined that picture rather than overturned it. Climate stress and human hunting were not competing explanations, but two forces acting on the same populations at once, each making the other more lethal than it would have been alone. That squeeze from both directions shows up directly in carrying capacity. A single Smilodon territory that once supported several adult cats, sustained by regular access to mammoth herds, ground sloths, and bison, could increasingly sustain only one. Litters that would once have grown up surrounded by abundant prey now had far less margin for error, and the species' complete inability to shift hunting strategy or body plan within only a few thousand years left it with no way to adapt to the shortage. By roughly 10,000 years ago, the saber-toothed tiger, the animal that had dominated the forests and grasslands of the Americas for longer than modern humans have existed as a species, was gone. It was swallowed up in that same wave of extinction, one of the fastest collapses of large mammals ever recorded in the fossil history of this planet. What makes the story of the Smilodon particularly striking is that it was not a weak or poorly adapted animal. It was, by nearly every measure paleontologists can study, one of the most powerful and successful predators that had ever existed on the continent. Its downfall was not a failure of strength. It was a failure to adapt quickly enough to a world being reshaped by the one predator capable of outthinking every advantage evolution had given it. Today, the only place you can encounter a saber-toothed tiger is in a museum hall, staring out from behind glass with its enormous canines frozen mid-snarl. Or you find it in the tar-blackened bones pulled year after year from beneath the streets of the American city, built directly on top of one of the greatest predator graveyards on Earth. Every one of those bones is a fragment of the same story. A slow, forest-wide contest between claw and spear, between instinct and strategy, that ended with an entire species running out of world to hunt in. The forest that once echoed with the roar of the most feared predator in the Americas fell silent, and what replaced that roar was something far quieter and far more dangerous. The sound of footsteps, moving with purpose, carrying tools no claw could ever match. If you made it this far, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, so you don't miss the next ones.